study for this morning. Okay. In Atonement and the Death of Christ, Craig defends the doctrine of penal substitution. Although this is a doctrine beloved of many theologically conservative Protestants, it has been the subject of unrelenting criticism in recent work on the doctrine of atonement. Craig's book attempts to deal with the doctrine via three sections. The first is exegetical, the second historical, and the third philosophical. There is not space in this short response to tackle all the arguments of Craig's book. Even if one is not sympathetic to the general thrust of his argument, he does seek to be as thorough as his terms of reference permit. Instead of giving a general overview of the work, I will zero in on two issues that relate to Craig's response to my own work on atonement, and which are, I think, at the heart of much recent criticism of penal substitution. The first has to do with forensic or legal fiction, that is part and parcel of many traditional accounts of penal substitution. The second has to do with the attempt to construct a version of penal substitution that takes seriously the sort of metaphysical realism that appears to be at work in Pauline theology, and especially in the Adam Christology of Romans 5:12-19. I will argue that in each case, Craig's objections can be challenged, and that failure to take these matters with sufficient seriousness represents a shortcoming in his articulation of penal substitution. I close with some remarks about the contribution of Craig's volume in the larger contemporary theological discussion of the doctrine of atonement. So in the third philosophical section of this book, Craig writes the following. Whether we think of imputation as God's adopting the legal fiction that Christ committed the sins for which we are condemned, or as God's holding Christ vicariously liable for our wrongdoing, Christ is, as a result of imputation, legally guilty before God. That is, legally liable to punishment. In this light, we can see how confused is Reformed theologian Oliver Crisp's characterization of penal substitution as a forensic fiction. Craig goes on to cite a passage from the Word enfleshed, in which I, Oliver Crisp, argue that historic defenders of penal substitution usually, but not always, trade on the notion of forensic fiction. This is the idea that God treats Christ as if he is guilty of the sin of fallen human beings and punishes him in place of fallen humanity. Christ is treated as if he were guilty, and the innocent suffers harsh treatment instead of the guilty. To this, Craig replies that Christ being declared legally guilty is no more fictitious than an employer being held guilty by the court for the wrongful acts done by a subordinate. What is more, he avers, even if the imputation of human sin to Christ is a legal fiction, this does not necessarily mean God treats Christ as if he were guilty of human sins. Rather, Christ may be legally guilty of those sins before God's bar, just as a ship is legally guilty of violating embargo laws in virtue of the courts adopting the fiction of ship personification. The idea seems to be that if legal guilt is equivalent to nothing more than liability, then Christ may be held responsible for the guilt accruing to the sin of the fallen humans. That is the point of the examples to which Craig appeals, coupled with jurisprudence. Under certain circumstances in law, an employer may be legally liable, that is, held responsible in law for the crime committed by her employee. What is more, the notion of legal persons, which are fictions created in law in order to prosecute certain courses of action, is a legal convention that, he thinks, may be helpfully applied to atonement theology. The example Craig cites from maritime law of a ship being treated as a legal person is illustrative in this regard. If Christ is merely legally liable for human sin, then the charge of legal fiction is harmless, for the notion need not simply imply Christ is personally responsible for the sin or guilt in question, just as in liability and culpability can come apart so that under certain circumstances, liability can be applied where there can be no personal culpability, as in the legal person of the embargoed ship. So also Christ may be held legally liable for human sin without personal culpability for that sin. But of course, this is not to demonstrate that legal fictions are unproblematic, or that the notion of legal liability without personal culpability may be appropriately ascribed to Christ in the Atonement. It is merely to point to examples in law where liability without personal culpability and even the generation of legal fictions are permissible. One would need to provide some reason for thinking that similar arrangements may be applicable in the case of atonement. What is more, by appealing to the jurisprudential examples he does, Craig in effect makes conceptual room for legal fictions in atonement theology, of precisely the sort I was concerned about in my earlier criticisms. At the close of the section of the chapter in which he raises this issue, Craig concedes, and I quote, "Part of the difficulty here, I think, is that Chris takes guilt to be the property of having committed a crime, a property that Christ did not exemplify, since he committed no crimes. While this understanding of guilt is in line with the opinion of many courts, it is problematic, as I shall argue in chapter 12, for one such understanding our guilt could never be removed in contradiction of Scripture." In other words, the alleged confusion is located in the conflation of legal liability with personal culpability. If Christ is legally liable but not personally culpable for human sin, then the problem I raise about legal fictions dissolves. However, not only is the conflation of liability and personal culpability in line with the opinion of many courts, in much criminal law, for example, but it is also in some traditional ways of understanding penal substitution. Take, for example, John Calvin, usually regarded as an important source for the doctrine. He says, quote, "To take away our condemnation, it was not enough for him to suffer any kind of death. To make satisfaction for our redemption, a form of death had to be chosen in which he might free us both by transferring our condemnation to himself and by taking our guilt upon himself. Thus we shall behold the person of a sinner, an evildoer represented in Christ. Yet from his shining innocence, it will at the same time be obvious that he was burdened with another sin rather than his own. This is our acquittal. The guilt that held us liable for punishment has been transferred to the head of the Son of God." Calvin's university training was in law, not theology. Yet what we see in this passage is that on his reckoning, it is not merely that Christ is held legally liable for the punishment of human sin, though this is part of the explanation of the justness of penal substitution. It is also that in his act of atonement, Christ takes our guilt upon himself, though he is innocent of sin. He is not merely held legally liable for human sin, the guilt of human sin is transferred to him so that he is held culpable for it and punished in the place of fallen humans. But this is exactly the point I made in my earlier work, and this is the reason why there is a serious moral problem at the heart of doctrines of penal substitution that trade on the notion that the innocent Christ is treated as both liable and culpable for human sin, and therefore punishable in place of fallen humans. Now, of course, it is perfectly reasonable for Craig to disagree with Calvin on this matter, and for him to provide an alternative way of conceiving of the mechanism of penal substitution, especially if it avoids perceived difficulties that the Reformation doctrine raises. But the fact is, it is a way of understanding the doctrine that is embedded in the teaching of one of the fountainheads of penal substitution, and that can still be found in the literature today. This is not so much an appeal to authority as it is an indication that there are reputable historic theologians whose views are at odds with Craig on this matter, and who do endorse the sort of problematic view he seeks to distance himself from, views which persist in some contemporary defenses of penal substitution. So the difficulty to which I was pointing is not some phantom conjured up by my own febrile imagination, but is indicative of a strand of the tradition that has sought to articulate one version of penal substitution. We now turn to chapter 12 of Craig's work for the promised sequel to his earlier remarks on this topic. There, Craig has a long discussion about the nature of guilt in legal theory. The central issue in this section turns on the claim that a pardon does not expunge the culpability accruing to past conduct and that has led to a particular conviction. This, in effect, equates guilt with having carried out the conduct that led to the conviction, a matter that Craig will not stomach. He writes that although such a view of guilt may reflect ordinary language usage, it has unfortunate implications if one places it within retributive justification for punishment. For on this view, he says, a person's guilt could never be expunged whether by pardon or punishment, even if a person has served his full sentence and so satisfied the demands of justice. He remains guilty, since it will be ineradicably and forever the case that once upon a time he did commit the crime. But then on standard theories of retributive justice, he still deserves punishment. For, as he goes on to say, it is axiomatic from attributive theories of punishment that the guilty deserve punishment. At this juncture, Craig reintroduces the notion of guilt as liability of punishment. According to Craig, a person who has been punished has paid her debt to society and is no longer guilty, that is, liable to punishment. Indeed, quote, if a pardon removes one's liability to punishment, then it also blots out guilt. It is impossible that a person be pardoned and yet remain guilty. The application of atonement theology yields a very similar result to the discussion earlier in the book. Once again, the idea would seem to be that Christ does not need to have committed any sin in order to be made liable to punishment. That is, to be made legally responsible for the sin of fallen humanity. If under certain circumstances, guilt is treated as mere liability to punishment, and fallen humans are the guilty parties who are liable to punishment, then that liability may be transferred to another, such that they take on the legal responsibility for the guilt of those parties who have actually committed the sin in question. Thus, Christ may in fact be treated as legally guilty of human sin and suffer the punishment due to fallen humans for their sin in their stead. Now, recall that Craig allows the idea that guilt is the property of having committed a crime in line, as he says, with the opinion of many courts. The issue then does not turn on whether guilt being the property of having committed a crime has legal precedent. The issue is that this way of construing the problem has the implication that a person's guilt can never be expunged. For it is forever the case that the person who has committed a given sin is the one who is guilty of having committed the sin and culpable for it. This, it seems, conflates several important matters. First, there is a long-standing theological distinction between a liability to guilt and a liability to punishment. Suppose a man commits cold-blooded murder. He is convicted. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and he freely confesses to being the murderer. He serves a very long custodial sentence for this crime and emerges from prison an old and broken man. Now, we would normally think that the old man released from prison is the same person as the one who committed the crime many years before. His conviction remains watertight. So it would be appropriate to say the old man released from prison, or of the old man who was released from prison, he is the person guilty of the cold-blooded murder 25 years ago. In this sense, he will always be the person guilty of that crime. But, having served his sentence, he is no longer liable to punishment. That is, upon being released from prison, he's a free man because he has served his debt to society. It is perfectly commonplace to say of a convicted murderer released from gaol that they are guilty of having committed the crime and that they have served their punishment. They cannot be punished again. Their debt is paid. But that does not mean they are no longer the person who is guilty of having committed the crime. Transposed into the language I've been using here, we may say that it is one thing to be held legally liable for the sin of another. It is another thing to be personally guilty of having committed that sin. And it is yet another thing to be the person guilty of having committed the crime, and to be punishable for that crime. If one is served a punishment for a crime, one is no longer legally liable to punishment, though one is always the person who has committed the crime in question. Now, Craig does see this. He remarks that in thinking about the role of pardons in legal theory, one should take tense seriously. The person who is pardoned for a crime is innocent from that moment at which the pardon comes into force. True, they were the person guilty of having committed the crime in the past. But upon being pardoned, they are no longer guilty. Craig says, as a result of the pardon, the offender is now as innocent as he could have been if he had never committed the offence. That seems to me to be partially true. It is true that someone pardoned for an offence is no longer legally liable for that offence from that moment at which the pardon comes into force. Once pardoned, the person cannot be punished for the crime they were alleged to have committed. But it is not quite right to say that the offender in question is as innocent as he would have been if he had never committed the crime. We can also say with reason that he is the one guilty of having committed the crime for which he was pardoned. For in this sense, a pardon presumes that there is some fault for which the person in question is liable to punishment, and which has been set aside, on the assumption that the person pardoned was indeed guilty of the crime in question. Matters are made clearer by appeal to the distinction between liability to guilt and liability to punishment. For once this distinction is applied, we can see that someone who is pardoned for a crime was guilty and culpable for that crime, but upon being pardoned is only guilty of having committed the crime. Personal culpability is removed by the pardon so that the perpetrator is no longer liable to punishment. In Craig's nomenclature, he is legally innocent, but he is still the one guilty for having committed the crime in question. This aspect of his guilt, the aspect that is not met by removing the liability to punishment, still obtains. This is what Alistair Stump, in a recent account of atonement, calls the stain of sin. There is something indelible about sin. It stains the soul, so to speak. This means that even when liability to punishment is removed, the stain remains like a birthmark or two. We are no longer legally liable for the stain, but neither can we remove it. Indeed, it is impossible to remove it once the sin in question has been committed, precisely because I am the one personally responsible for having carried it out in the first place. Now let us take stock. Craig claims that the view according to which some versions of penal substitution trade on the notion of legal fiction is confused. He thinks this confusion arises because of the conflation of legal liability with personal culpability. Christ is not personally culpable for sin because he commits no sin. He is innocent. Nevertheless, he may be held legally liable for human sin without personal culpability for that sin. This distinction between personal culpability and legal liability is the cornerstone of Craig's response. I have shown that Christ is, in some sense, taken to be both personally culpable and liable for human sin, at least in some historic Protestant thought, for example in Calvin, as well as some contemporary literature too. It is because Christ is said to be both personally culpable and liable for human sin that he may be punished in a place of fallen humans. Craig attempts to ameliorate this worry by dropping personal culpability and emphasizing the fact that Christ is merely legally liable for human sin. It is not that Christ is punished for our sin, strictly speaking. Instead, he is held legally liable for our sin and suffers the penal consequences of human sin that would be a punishment if he were served the harsh treatment that culminates in his death on the cross. This is indeed a version of penal substitution, what is sometimes called the penal consequence view. But it is not the only version of the doctrine, as Craig admits. The punishment version of penal substitution, theologians like Calvin articulate, is also present in the tradition and is still defended today. My argument was principally directed at those who adopted the punishment version of the doctrine. Those who do not adopt Craig's penal consequences version of the doctrine and remain committed to a punishment version still have to answer the question about how the innocent Christ can be accounted personally guilty of sin he did not commit. That is a forensic fiction. Now,